Welcome to the Pulling the Threads podcast. This is part two of a podcast that I had recorded with author David LeBlanc. Um, it went really long, so we had to cut it into two pieces. First part, we really started with Christian origins. What is Christianity as we know it? And then how do we understand it before it became what it is, looking through the historical critical method? What are the ancient roots of it? And so this is a part two of that. Again, if you like the podcast, please follow the Pulling the Threads podcast on YouTube. Join the Facebook group, Pulling the Threads podcast, and follow the blog at JesusTheJewWithinJudaism.com. And I hope you enjoy this podcast episode. And please share with your friends and family who you might think that find this interesting.
To the Pauls of the world, whoever Paul was, or if he even existed, whoever wrote in Paul's name, which is largely what we have today. We have a bunch of documents written in Paul's name that have had cut and paste and scissor marks and stitch points all over them. We have very little core Paul, if there is any. And none of it existed in the earliest church records. Don't have any Paul. We don't know of Paul except until after Marcion supposedly discovers his letters.
Yeah.
That's what. So, and we know that the Gnostics considered Paul to be a founder of their movement.
Yeah.
And so once
even the early proto-Orthodox considered Paul to be a heretic. The early Ebionites thought Paul was a heretic, and it wasn't until after Marcion found his letters, and then the proto-Orthodox decided to massage and revitalize them, and then redact his letters further, that all of a sudden Paul gets a revival. And so that was kind of the point I was going to get to, is that our textual tradition starts with Marcion's gospel, Marcion's finding of the epistles, and then the proto-Orthodox redactions start appearing after this. We don't have texts that exist before Marcion when it comes to gospels and epistles. And the later ones are redactions of him, and therefore Marcion may have invented Paul based upon Josephus, maybe the spouter of lies that Eisenman is referring to. But there's parallels between Josephus and Paul and their background, the 3 years in the wilderness, similar Platonic ideas when it comes to playing with the myth and what becomes the seabed of Christianity. So the textual tradition. Now I characterize what I think the early followers of Jesus were. Now when we come to the textual tradition, Marcion is, yes, I would agree with the Marcion priority that his came first. I mean, chicken or egg, we have his letters, and then everything else that becomes Christianity is a reaction to his.
Yeah.
So you have his letters, the proto-Orthodox redaction, and then you have the Catholicization where they go back in again. And it's why it seems like 3 or 4 times, Paul's like, what's going on? He's changing his mind, or he's arguing against himself. And then I would consider a majority of the New Testament, even James and Jude, to be Catholic documents written by Catholicists too, and even Luke and Acts as Catholicists to assuage the image of Paul, who the Orthodox and the Ebionites saw as a heretic originally, but a convenient co-opt when they wanted to rewrite the history, because there's so much in his text that was great towards the influencing and manipulation.
Let me just make. Yeah, I totally agree with everything you just said, but it brings what you just said brings home the point that I was trying to make. So let me make my final.
Go ahead.
When we're talking about Christian origins, in my opinion, we have to understand that, and this is why I get so aggravated with the historicity mythicist debate. Because what we're dealing with in the development of the Christian religion is the same thing we're dealing with in the development of Judaism, the same thing we're dealing with in any of these ancient thought traditions. But specifically Christianity, let's talk about that. People can debate until the cows come home who Jesus was, when he lived, when the Gospels were written, who's Peter, who's Paul, any of this stuff. What we have to understand is that what we have is an ongoing power struggle of ideas.
Yes.
That's what's going on in the development of the religion. That's why we have so much debate about what came first, and whose ideas were prevalent, and when did this arise, and when did Gnosticism arise, and everybody's got their angle on it because they're all trying to politic for their particular brand that they adhere to. So the idea of a historical Jesus becomes an obstacle to true discovery, because the idea of a historical Jesus puts in play the notion, which is a false notion, that in order for us to get to the original core Christians, we have to find the original Jesus. I disagree with that notion. If you want to find the origins of Christianity, you're not looking for a person. You're looking for a set of ideas.
Yeah.
How did the ideas that became Orthodox Christianity become ascendant? What was the process in which the battle was won over the ideas? How did the Trinity win out? How did the idea of, how was it that Valentinianism and modalism was defeated and the Trinitarian model won? How was it that we ended up with Paul, who was so closely associated with Marcion? After Marcion is rejected as a heretic, how is it that Paul becomes so central to Christian doctrine when he was introduced by Marcion? How do we have this idea that there's 4 gospels when we know that there was a lot more?
Yeah.
How do we have this idea of, you mentioned it, we have these Catholic epistles like 1st and 2nd Timothy, we have Titus, and all these epistles. I mean, anybody without half a brain can see that 1st and 2nd Timothy is talking about issues that shouldn't even come up until the 3rd century. We're talking about bishops and deacons and all this stuff.
Yeah.
There's no need for any of that in the 50s when Paul is writing. Like you mean to tell me that Paul is worried about this wild, huge network of believers that have to have authority over them and listen to your elders? Like, what are you talking about? There was no Christianity in Rome for Nero to persecute. So all this narrative that is accepted as mainstream, most of it is propaganda. And so we have to understand that what we're dealing with, and you mentioned this at the very beginning of our conversation, that there was a time period that we know of that is well documented where Christianity became the ideas, let me just rephrase that, the set of ideas and values that become the Christian doctrinal position on life, doesn't really have ascendancy until the 4th, 5th century.
Yeah.
Before that, it's just a nonstop, often violent debate.
Yeah.
Of who's going to win out. And who's going to win out is the elites that are in charge. That's the answer to that question. So if we want to understand the origins of the religion, we have to understand who was in charge of the culture, who were the major players, who were the major movers and shakers, what was their incentive, what was their motivation, what would they have to gain, what would a Philo or a Josephus or a Flavian emperor have to do with Christianity? What would be their incentive? What would be their ideas that they were trying to promote? So we know, for instance, as an example, and this alludes to some of the work of Valiant and Fahey, but the reality is that we have to understand that there was an incentive behind Josephus writing his Antiquity of the Jews. Why was that commissioned? Because I believe, personally, this is just my view, and I'm not asking anyone to share this view, this is just what I'm convinced of, that I think the only writings that we have that survived that period of the 1st century is the writings of Josephus. I think all the writings of the New Testament came after 100 AD. And I personally think that most all of them came from well after 130 AD. And I think, we don't have any proof otherwise. And I know that Josephus wrote, he had to have written before he died. So Josephus wrote after the war because he was commissioned by the emperor who had the money to publish the works.
Yeah.
So,
well,
right,
this
so,
was too. So he switched sides, and he became, the voice for, the Roman Empire. So he served on one side, then after he
Right.
destroyed the temple, now he's a propagandist for the Roman government.
Right. And Josephus, it should be pointed out, Josephus declared the emperor to be the Messiah.
Yeah.
And so did Ben Zakkai, the Jewish rabbi. He declared him to be a fulfillment of prophecy. That's right in the Talmud. So the idea that Christianity has its origins in some person is so infantile.
It's a myth.
It's intellectually infantile. It's knuckle dragger reasoning, and the only reason people adhere to this type of reasoning is because they have a religious bias and a desire to believe it.
Yes.
Right. So once you divorce yourself from your own personal biases of belief, and you look at the religion itself, you realize Jesus is a typological figurehead that is the focused attention point that the inventors of the religion want you to have.
Yeah.
They want you focusing on this Jesus character, when really behind the scenes it's like the Wizard of Oz. He's pulling all the levers behind the curtain. You've got all these machinations and political designs on the text. And the text is designed to conform people's thinking into this is what we want you to believe. When I was talking to Robert Price, and he talked about this in his book, he details this in his book extensively, that 1 Corinthians, according to the Church Fathers, was considered basically a member's handbook, if you will, for the early believers. This is how they regulated behaviors. 1 Corinthians was distributed everywhere. Well, when you start breaking down 1 Corinthians, you start realizing you've got decades and even centuries of debated issues in that text, in that epistle. Things that you've got the Encratites, who were they were the ascetics who believed that they were married, but they shouldn't have sex with their spouse. You've got that represented in the Pauline epistles. You've got Gnosticism represented in the Pauline epistles. You've got church politics represented. So Paul is like, he becomes the Jesus of the emerging church. So you've got the figurehead Jesus, and then you've got this Paul character who everybody uses for their own advantage, and they keep changing his writings in order to massage the message to be consistent with the going politics of the day. And this goes on for hundreds of years. Hundreds of years. I mean, all you got to do is listen to you got to listen to what's his name? I just went blank. The famous scholar Ehrman, Bart Ehrman, who's a linguistic expert. I don't agree with him on everything, but he'll come out and say that there's over 20,000 scribal redactions in the New Testament that they've found through linguistic analysis, which means
I think it's 200,000.
Oh, is it that much? Maybe I had the number wrong, which is even more astounding.
500,000 textual variants in the New Testament, whereas comparatively, there's about 20,000 textual variants in the Tanakh.
Right, well, let me get to that, because you talked about that, and I didn't get a chance to address that. You talked about you spent quite a bit of time talking about the differences when we start to compare the diversity of thought within early Judaism versus diversity of thought within early Christianity. Yes, there are certainly some diverse groups in early ancient Judaism. However, as you correctly pointed out, there's also a consensus of origins there.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not talking about modern scholarship, talking about when Deuteronomy was written or anything. I'm talking about they all have a Torah.
Yeah.
But when in Christianity, because Christianity, the history of Christianity. So I was about to mention before we had our technical difficulties, there's a scholar named Elaine Pagels. My son-in-law had a chance to meet her in person at the Society of Biblical Literature. Very fascinating woman. She's very quirky. But essentially, she has a theory which I think is brilliant. I don't know if she's right, but she has a theory that basically the Gospels were intentionally backdated to a period that couldn't be verified.
Yeah.
So by putting the Gospels into the period of Pontius Pilate.
Yeah.
You have a historical figure, and then you can create a fiction around that historical figure, because once Jerusalem is destroyed, there's no way to verify the actors in the story.
Yeah.
So it's a genius thing. Fiction writers do this all the time. How many fiction books are written around? You look at Tom Clancy novels, or all these different modern writers who take real events, real people, and they craft a story around it that is highly believable because, well, this is a real person, and this is a real event. And
I mean, you can't verify it, so you can't fall.
Exactly. So I bring that up only to say that it's very clear that, and by the way, this is also true of all the major religious figures in the ancient world. This is true of Buddha. This is true of Krishna. This is true of all these different people. None of them have, even Romulus, who, we believe there was a Romulus, right? But the stories surrounding Romulus and the founding of Rome are fantastic. They're not real. So we have all these. This is what people do. The last thing I'll say, I'm sorry, I went a little longer than I meant to, but so I had a chance. I was talking to Rabbi Tovia Singer, and he ended up talking about this on one of his shows with Tanakh Talk with William Hall, who runs Tanakh Talk. So Rabbi Singer was at one time a rabbi, the head rabbi in India, believe it or not. So he took a job in India as the head rabbi for the Jewish community in that part of the world. He was only there for a few years, I think. But while he was there, there was this Hindu guru guy, very, very famous guy, who had millions of followers. He would have rallies, and there'd be millions of people that would show up, and there'd be miracle healings and all the same stuff you'd see in the evangelical world.
So I know the laughing revival within Pentecostal movement actually has its roots in this Hindu thing, where the laughing revival and healings and stuff. Like, I don't even want to delve into that.
No. I'm not trying to. The point I'm trying to make is that this guy ends up having a massive heart attack and he dies while Singer is there. Has massive heart attack. Now, there was all these prophecies about this guy, about how he was going to rise from the dead and how he was going to revive the whole world. I finally realized that sound is coming from my headset. It's not from you. So hopefully you can still hear me okay. But this guy dies, and Singer says that within a week, there were women coming on public television claiming that they saw him as a risen person and saw him rise from the dead. And he spoke words to them, and they had things to share. Within a week of this guy dying. So all to point out, like people who say that you can't come up with a mythical Jesus because the timeline's too soon. It can happen in days.
Yeah.
It can happen in days. So this is where I'm willing to concede. Like I try not to be dogmatic about my dating of the Gospels, because it's certainly possible that these Gospels could have been written a short time after a historical person, and they could have just elaborated and embellished like crazy, and now you have the legend. But either way, the point is that the religion develops over a period of time through the debate over ideas. It's not like let's say that you and I are very close friends and you have a huge following, right? And all of a sudden I'm out on a hike with you someday and you die on the trail. And then all of a sudden I see all these stories coming out about, what was really going on with you and what really happened. And I would say, well, no, I can categorically say that all of what you're saying is not true, because I was physically there with him in person. I have photos of him. Look, here's my photographs. Here's my transcripts of my conversations with him on Zoom. Like, this is what he was. This is what he believed. Everything you're saying is false. And everybody was like, oh, okay, right. He's an eyewitness testimony.
Yeah.
We don't have any eyewitness testimony that's verifiable at all. Yeah. Everything is a story and a legend. And the proof of that is that none of the Gospels agree with each other.
Yeah, centuries and decades. There's no consistency to the diversity of early gospels and epistles. There's no, I mean, that's why scholars only agree that he was probably baptized and died, and the rest we can't agree on.
That's one thing. So I interviewed at one time. I interviewed Jack Buck, who is a PhD candidate. I think he's got his PhD now. I could be wrong, but he was a PhD candidate studying under Marcus Vincent. So Marcus Vincent is a preeminent Marcion priority scholar in the world, and Jack Buck is one of his chief students. And Jack Buck's specialty is Irenaeus, if I say that name right, Irenaeus. Irenaeus. I said it with the wrong emphasis. So one of the things he said that struck me, and by the way, Jack Buck is a Christian. He believes in Jesus, the whole thing. He's a Catholic. But Jack Buck says that one of the things that's really interesting, and he's an expert on Irenaeus' letters, which I won't get into here, but he said the earliest writings in the Christian world have no knowledge of Paul at all.
Yeah.
What they talk about, they talk about the crucifixion. They talk about Jesus died and rose again. That's consistent. But they don't have anything to say about Paul, which is really fantastic when you consider the fact that you've got epistles that allude to, like Peter alludes to the controversial writings of Paul, and you've got all this doctrine and church theology built on this guy who the earliest Christians don't know anything about. And we have to go into the writings such as the homilies and the Clementine recognitions and all these other things to find out anything about Paul.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out earlier, it seems like in the New Testament we have kind of a negotiated truce, especially in the book of Acts, between all these competing elements, like you alluded to. We've got all these different groups that have all these different particular beliefs, and then later, much later, there's an attempt to try to gloss over the discrepancies and try to create a mirage of a unified front, such as the Jerusalem Council of Acts 15. Alleged Jerusalem Council, which, as a Jew, I find incredibly unlikely.
Yes. I that's a mythological account. I don't agree. I think, and you look in the homilies, I don't think Peter and James would have ever conceded to that.
Correct.
I don't think that would have. No, this new Paul way that's kind of like Noahides or something. I don't think they would have ever agreed to that. I still believe that I'm convinced they would believe in discipleship, circumcision, mikvah as the way that and there's textual tradition to support that now. But I do kind of want to do a transition here, though.
Yeah, that's a good time for it. Yeah,
because maybe 30, 40 minutes max left, but I want to transition. We've done some good foundation work. I'm probably going to break this into 3 episodes now just because of content, and I think we got that. I do want to transition. We've laid a good foundation of what Christianity, how it came to be. I want to move into the modern age, post-Catholicization of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire and the ideas of Christianity winning Western Europe and America, the Reformation, and then, the Protestant Reformation, and then the evangelical uprising in America. And then now we come to our modern term. And we're going to leave out a lot of that period just because I want to move to the jux of my point while we lay the foundation the way I did is that now I want to talk about the Messianic evangelical movement and how they get some things wrong. There's 4 key points that I'd like to kind of get into. 1, the Jewishness of Jesus and how their rabbi Jesus validates their twist on Christianity, and how I would completely disagree with that summation that this Jewish rabbi Jesus that gives a Jewish flavor to Christianity somehow makes things okay. Point 1. Point 2 is the new view of Paul as, Paul within Judaism and Gabriel Boccaccini's Paul within Enochian Judaism, like a branch of Hellenistic Essene Judaism, and then how this Jesus in the festivals, which I just have the hugest problem with. You know, Jesus as a Passover lamb is so troubling. That would be the third one. And the last one, the Messianism that co-ops Hasidism, the veneration of Rebbe Menachem Schneerson.
Yeah.
And so I kind of like to talk about the problems of the Messianic Jewish Jesus and how this doesn't validate Christianity and it doesn't validate Messianic Judaism, because one, part and parcel, Messianic Judaism by all branches of Judaism is not Judaism. Their veneration of a single rabbi, salvation in Jesus, even if they demote Jesus to a lesser, not a God, they still believe in Paul's soteriology, the salvation in Jesus, which is not a historical Jewish. There's not the belief of a person to save your soul. It was national redemption. You know, and we don't have to really get into that as much, but how do they get the Jewish Jesus wrong? How does them propagating Jewish Jesus to promote them fail? When we look at what I just described and how we characterized early Jewish Christianity, for no better term, just so that people know what we're talking about, I'd call it Judaism that never went the way of Christianity, would be my definition. But that which became Christianity is separate from what I would have couched that as the religion that was invented, formed over time. So how do they get the Jewish Jesus wrong? Start with that one. Then how do they get the new view of Paul wrong? And at some point, I want to touch on this Jesus in the festivals, how he could never be the Passover lamb, or he doesn't fulfill Sukkot, the whole, you know, misunderstanding of God with us. And then we can move into the Messianism. So I'd like to kind of hit as much of this as we can in the next 30 minutes or so. And then I will have to cut off at 5:45.
No, that's fine. I'll have to go too. So do you want me to just go ahead and try to tackle those, or you want to do that?
With 4 points. And so let's start with, you know, how do they get the Jewishness of Jesus wrong, and how does them promulgating the Jewishness of Jesus to promote their branch of Christianity fail to understand, one, the historical Jesus, the myth making of Christianity, and the Messianic movement?
Right. So the Jewishness of Jesus first. It's a bit of a trap. Obviously, if you're telling the world that Jesus was born a Jew, he's Jewish. I mean, it's the most obvious thing. Well, Jesus is Jewish after all, you know. So that's the obvious inroad to try to get people interested in the Messianic perspective. Well, after all, Jesus was a Jew. So again, the presumption that's false is based on the same false presumption that creates the misunderstanding of Christian origins. So anyone who studies church history or Christian origins at any level, even if they're a believer, and most people begin that way when they study this stuff, they have to admit that, as you correctly said, the Christianity that developed had a adolescent period where there was a lot of different perspectives before there was an orthodoxy. The same is true in Judaism. There was a lot of development over a long period of time before there was a consensus of Jewish orthodoxy.
Yeah.
So to try to put Jesus, and I did this at one point. I used to study the Talmud constantly, looking for stories and teachings that would be reminiscent of the teachings of Jesus. And I would find many, and I would write about them. I had a blog. I used to teach at a Messianic synagogue. I would be a guest teacher on frequent occasions, and they would always love it when I would give them rabbinic, Talmudic parallels to Jesus. They would love that. They would eat it up. Looking back on it, I regret that stuff. I still have my notes from some of those studies. I could send them to you. The truth of the matter is that there's a lot of explanations as to why there would be parallels to Jesus's teachings and stuff in the Talmud. None of them can be attributed to the fact that he was a Jewish rabbi.
Yeah.
All of them have their roots in the same things that, if you've studied the Talmud, if anyone listening here has studied the Talmud at length or been taught the Talmud through Talmudic study with a rabbi or a group of rabbis, would know that the Talmud, they call it the sea of the Talmud. You don't read the Talmud or study the Talmud the same way you would read the book of Romans. It's a dialectic. It's a conversation. So even things that the rabbis today do not agree with or condone are laid out in full view in the Talmud as part of the dialectic. For instance, there's a passage in Sanhedrin that describes the halakhic parameters for how you are to sacrifice your children to Molech. Believe it or not, it's shocking, but it's true. That doesn't mean that you're ever going to find a rabbi or a rabbinic organization of any denomination that is going to tell you that, oh yeah, well, absolutely, you can go ahead and sacrifice your children to Molech. No, that's not part of Judaism.
No.
But it's in the Talmud. Why is it in the Talmud? Because at one point in history, that was an issue that was discussed among the scholars, and it's recorded. So we know that there's things in the Talmud that are taught by Hillel in the debates between Hillel and Shammai, and Shammai says this and Hillel says this, and he, and there's always the stereotypical, which are not always true, but the stereotypical idea that Hillel was always on the side of leniency and Shammai was always on the side of strictness, which is not always true. Many times the sages sided with Shammai. They didn't always side with House of Hillel. But the reality is that Jesus is portrayed by the Messianics as being a rabbi after the school of Hillel.
Yeah.
It's a shell game. It's a shell game. If you really study the character of Jesus, Jesus is another example of a pagan mystery God-man.
Yeah.
That's what Jesus is. He's not a rabbi. And you can try to make all these arguments, but the Messianics do. They make these arguments, oh, no, Jesus, if you strip away the virgin birth and you strip away all these doctrines that are highly problematic to the Jewish world, and we should be clear, and you haven't said this, but for the audience, if they don't know, 90% of the Messianic world believes in core Christian evangelical doctrine.
Yes, they do.
Right. It's a very small percentage of the Messianic world that actually adheres to Jewish teaching. Or follows authentic Jewish practices. They're a very, very small group. It's really just there's a huge, and when you think about it, I'll just make this comment as a wrap up to my statement on this. For people who have become disillusioned with their church or the shallowness of their religious life, the idea of exploring the depths of the Jewish Jesus is incredibly appealing to a lot of people. It's the idea that I'm going to know, in fact, the famous organization First Fruits of Zion, they have what they call a Torah club where they sign people up and you get involved in these small groups and you have a facilitator and they go through these modules where they go through the Parsha cycle with the eyes of, what do we see Jesus in this, in the Parsha cycle. And all of it, their motto is get to know Jesus better. So with the mantra of you're going to get to know Jesus better if you can understand him from a Hebraic perspective. That's the idea. But what they're doing is they're not getting to know Jesus better at all. All they're doing is they're reinventing the Jesus of their imagination to fit their new fantasy.
Yeah.
That's all they're doing. They're taking a hodgepodge of their evangelical background and they're mixing it with what little knowledge they have. These people are famous. They'll go to the Chabad website and they'll try to navigate the Chabad website because Chabad is very messianic, and they'll get all these teachings about Messiah. And we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but a lot of these people, they love this stuff. They love it because it gives them a sense of validation that they've gone. And most of them are very triumphalistic in their attitude. Like we're a deeper Christian than the average Christian. Average evangelical Christianity is very shallow, but we're going deep because we're we're getting to the roots of what Jesus was really like according to the people that he's associated with. And there's all this excitement about, we're going to support Israel, and we're going to support the rabbis, we're going to fight anti-Semitism, we're going to do all these really wonderful, well-worthy things, and yet they have nothing to do with Jesus. And people should know that most Messianic organizations, the vast majority of Messianic organizations that are out there, are expressly dedicated to trying to convert Jews into becoming Christians. That's their goal.
Yeah.
So once you know that, you realize that this is a sham. This is a farce. It's not real.
Yeah.
It's an evangelical ploy.
Evangelicalism, the term that comes to mind for me is wolf in sheep's clothing. It's what Rabbi Sarah Shapiro, in her book on Messianic Judaism, she was a Reformed Jew, refers to as cross-dressing Gentiles. My experience with Dr. Raymond Gandon, Jewish Voice, and King Seminary, the Gentiles encourage dressing up as more Orthodox to convert,
Yes.
Jews. And so let's touch on first Hebraic roots and then the alleged Orthodox from, so the Hebrew roots, the tabernacle, Jesus fills the tabernacle, Jesus fulfills the festivals. Somehow he's the Passover lamb, and he's also Sukkot. There's a problem with this because, how does a man become a lamb? Each man was given once to live, and in the judgment, no man, a father can't die for his son, son can't die for his father.
Ezekiel 18.
Failure to understand Judaism. Jesus can't fulfill the festivals, and he can't be a Passover lamb, which doesn't take away the sins of the world, despite, in Judaism. Christianity is going to say one thing, but, Judaism, Passover lamb didn't take away the sins of the world. So if he becomes he doesn't fulfill the festivals and the prophets.
Let me go further.
Yeah.
If I can interrupt you for 1 second, let's now transition to the Passover lamb thing, right? Not only does the Passover lamb not take away the sins of the world, it doesn't take away the sins of anyone. It doesn't deal with sin. So this is one of the biggest fallacies that exist, is the idea that Jesus represents the blood put on the lintel of the doorpost by the Hebrews in Egypt.
Yeah.
On a fundamental level, it's a misunderstanding of the story. It's a false Christian teaching, first of all, that Jesus is the typology of the blood on the lintels. The truth of the matter is that the curse, according to the Torah, was against the firstborn, and people who were Jewish were to put the blood on the lintel of their doorpost to identify them as Jewish, so that their firstborn wouldn't die. So conceptually, any Jewish family in Egypt that didn't obey Moses' edict, their firstborn child would die. So people don't understand that in the Jewish world, according to Jewish teaching, there were Egyptians that also put blood on their lint posts so that their oldest children wouldn't die. And those Egyptians went out with the Jews in the Exodus.
A great multitude, yeah.
It wasn't simply just the Hebrews. So, of course, Christians will say, well, that just proves the universal salvation. No, there's no salvation message in the Passover event. The Passover event was a solemn event it was like people are dying around us and we're just being spared. But the idea was, and of course I don't believe it was a historical event, but that's neither here nor there. But the reality is that Christian doctrine tries to appropriate the blood in the Passover story as representative of the shed blood of Jesus Christ for the sins of the world. There are no Jewish people who were saved, quote unquote, by obeying this injunction. They were simply spared the death of the firstborn.
Yeah.
So it's a completely false analogy to begin with. The other thing that they do is they conflate the Passover story with Yom Kippur, with the sacrifice of Yom Kippur.
Yes.
One of the things, this is even more egregious in my opinion, is that how a Messianic Christian can participate in the Yom Kippur ceremony
Yeah.
and the Rosh Hashanah ceremony, which happens 7 to 10 days previous. So in Judaism, we all know that there is blood all over the worship system. The cult worship system has blood everywhere.
Yeah.
But most people do not know that there is not a single offering in the Levitical system which deals with intentional sin. Not one. There's not one sacrifice that deals with willful sin. The only remedy for sin in Judaism is repentance and change and a heartfelt return to God. That's the teaching of Judaism, is that you return to God and he blesses you and restores you. That's the whole point. It's not about sacrifice.
No.
The sacrifice is about cleansing the temple.
Yeah. Yes.
So that's why if there's people never think to ask the question, like, how can Judaism still exist today if there's no temple? Don't they realize that Jesus fulfilled it? No, Jesus didn't fulfill anything. If the temple was so critical to the existence of Jewish belief, then it wouldn't have survived the destruction of the temple. That's not the case. Judaism does not rely upon animal sacrifice for atonement to God, period. Not only that, if the Passover, go back to Passover for a second, if the Passover lamb was so critical for the health of the Jewish soul, why is that practice in Exodus not duplicated today all around the world? You don't see any Jews putting blood on their doorposts anywhere in the world, not in Jerusalem or anywhere else. Why? Because it has nothing to do with the health of the Jewish soul. It was a plague.
Yeah.
It was an act of obedience during a plague in a foreign land. It has its time and place. It's commemorated in Jewish culture and history and religion. It has nothing to do with the salvation of a soul. All right, but back to the Yom Kippur thing. So I remember standing in a Messianic synagogue. We went through the whole Rosh Hashanah thing, right? Now, it's very fascinating because, as you know, in Rosh Hashanah is, people always think that Yom Kippur is the judgment. Yes. But really, it happens at Rosh Hashanah. So Rosh Hashanah, the blowing of the shofar, is supposed to silence the objections of the enemy, of the Hasatan, so that the people can have an uninterrupted audience with their king in order to have their soul restored. And it's during the period of Rosh Hashanah where the judgment is rendered. And then at Yom Kippur, your fate is sealed for the following year.
Yeah.
That's Jewish tradition. Most people don't know that. There's very few Christians that have ever experienced or even know about the Rosh Hashanah ceremony.
Yeah.
Even though it's in the Bible. Christians don't talk about it. They don't teach about it. If you believe that there is relevance to the Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, to what we call the high holidays. So the high holidays of the Jewish year culminate in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I have been, as you have been, in liberal synagogues where you have Jews who don't even attend synagogue all year long, and on Rosh Hashanah they will pack the joint out because they know the family is being called together. They go there because it's the time for the family to be called to account, not because of any of their faith or any. Many of them do have faith, many of them don't have faith, but they're still there. They're there because they're part of the tribe. It's part of the family. It's the ritual. So if you believe that Jesus is your atonement, if you believe that you are rectified to God by the shed blood of Jesus Christ, there is no world in which you should be participating in Yom Kippur, whether you're Jewish or not. Because if you're Jewish, you realize that the salvation of my soul is not up to an individual. I'm part of a tribe.
Yeah.
And in Judaism, every Jew's soul goes back to Sinai, and we're all part of the same soul. We're all sparks of the same root. And so every Jew that has ever lived for all of time, according to Jewish theology, and I don't care if you're part of the Reform movement, the Conservative movement, the Orthodox movement, the Hasidic movement, your soul was considered to have been present at Sinai.
Yes.
You don't get saved.
Salvation.
You are part of a tribe.
Yeah.
It's not a salvation religion. So this mixture of Messianic evangelical ideas with Jewish practice is the true definition of an abomination. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't exist. You have to choose one. If you're either following Christianity or you're following Judaism. Judaism has no need for Jesus, and Christianity has no need for Jewish ritual.
Yeah.
Period. And if you're trying to mix the two because you think you're connecting with the Hebraic original Jesus, this is why I have such an issue with people fighting over historicity. Yeah. Because you're missing the whole point of the religion. Jesus is a figurehead representing a set of ideas. Yeah. He has nothing to do with Judaism. Nothing to do with Sukkot. You mentioned Sukkot.
Yeah, none.
Nothing. Sukkot is a ritual of the Exodus. It is a festival. Now, the argument is made, even by the Noahide teachers, the rabbis, that Sukkot is the only festival of all the Jewish rituals that does have the world in mind. It has the Goyim in mind also, as well as the Jews, but not in the context of salvation, and certainly not in the context of Jesus. Has nothing to do with Jesus at all. Nothing. Unless you buy the hogwash that Jesus was a misunderstood Hasidic Chabad rabbi that would have worn a black suit with white shirts and tzitzit in the first century, which is, they have. Most people don't understand how anachronistic the Messianic Hasidic Jesus is, because the Hasidic movement doesn't exist until the 18th century. Well, it starts in the 14th century, but really, I mean, when you talk about Chabad and the Breslov movement, all that stuff, that's all post-Isaac Luria. That's all, and we can get into that if you want. I don't know if I'm jumping ahead of you.
Hey, not today. But yes. Yeah, so, I mean.
I get fired up about this, so I apologize to your audience. I get a little fired up.
We got 15 minutes max. I want to agree with something you were saying. Tehillim, the Psalm says, if you do what's right, you'll be forgiven. Therefore, if I do what's right, even at, Rosh Hashanah, where, we apologize to our brothers and sisters for, things we've done the previous year, the repentance, doing right, the sacrifice is unnecessary. So, failure to understand and in trying to put Jesus in these festivals it fails to understand Judaism, and therefore it totally has a faulty foundation, which we've kind of talked about some of that. The Hebraic roots, I want to try to do the last 2 points if possible, because we've kind of touched on the Hebraic roots. According to, Judaism, Jesus is an irrelevant marginal Jew. And there's, historically, he has no place really in Judaism. Now, Christianity that has belief in Judaism is something that Jews would wrestle with. But that's another issue. Moving past the Hebrew roots to the,
I didn't answer that question. Do you want me to deal with that? I never dealt with that. You want me to quickly address that?
Yeah, and then...
you don't have much time.
Yeah, keep it brief.
All I wanted to say, so I forgot to mention that, because that's something I glossed over. It's important for your audience to understand, if you haven't already educated them about this, that Hebrew roots has to be carefully distinguished from the Messianic Jewish movement. They are separate movements. Hebrew roots is a cult. Hebrew roots is a misappropriation of certain Jewish practices from the perspective of Christian rebellion. So Hebrew roots is mostly made up of people who have rejected the mainstream church, and they read the Bible and they try to just take on whatever is written in the text of the Bible. They're going to start doing that. If it tells us, I have to, so you'll see Hebrew roots people, they'll be tying strings to their belt loops, and they'll be, blowing shofar every 5 minutes. And whereas Messianic Judaism as an organized movement has governing bodies to it. There are different bodies. So basically, Messianic Judaism is largely split up between people that came out of the charismatic movement versus people that came out of the Baptist or more conservative parts of Christianity, and their fellowships and the tenor of their fellowship is reflective of their background. So in Messianic synagogues and in Hebrew root congregations where they come from charismatic backgrounds, you're going to see a lot of the charismatic elements that you would normally find like in an Assemblies of God or what have you, people speaking in tongues, dancing around waving flags around, and you're going to see all this same stuff because that's what they know, that's what they're comfortable with, and they just appropriate it to the Jewish thing. Whereas people that come from a more conservative bent tend to be a little bit more scholarly. They tend to be more interested in the study of the text, and they're less interested in the experiential elements, and they're more interested in really immersing themselves into the philosophical tradition. And it's from that side of Messianic Judaism that you find most of the people who leave it and convert to Judaism. Because when they get involved, and you and I think, probably are in that camp, where we got involved in the study. And as we studied ourselves out of the Christian thing, and we found ourselves more attracted to Judaism. So that's a very small percentage, though, of the Messianic Jewish world. And within that world, so in Hebrew roots, you've got people, and I forget his name now, but there's this famous TV personality. Maybe he's dead now, but he used to dress up like a prophet, and he had all these crazy gaudy clothes, and he very flamboyant, and he was a former pastor, and he had a very popular following. I forget his name. And then, like from the Messianic Jewish world, one of the more prominent organizations is First Fruits of Zion, which they've had a very business-like and strategic way that they've entered the market. Their base is mostly Baptist, Southern Baptists, but they are all missionary. And that's the thing I wanted to point out, is that whether it's Hebrew roots or whether it's Messianic Jewish movements, all of them, whether more subtly than others, they all seek to proselytize Jews because they believe that they are part of the original Jesus movement that is trying to recapture original Christianity. And that's why this conversation is relevant. And I just wanted to make that point.
Oh, no, that's a great point, and kind of touches on where I was going next. But before we fully delve in, we kind of talked about what's wrong with the Jewishness of Jesus and how they get the Jewishness wrong. And if he existed, that whole festival, Passover thing just fails. All right, so the next place that Messianics go, that the new view of Paul, trying to put Paul within the rabbinic Jewish tradition, and its halakha, and its pesharim, and its midrash, and Paul is Jewish, and therefore Christianity is a midrash that became, out of Paul's writing, which, oh my God, that's the worst thing ever. So basically, you embrace Platonianism, Mithraism, deification, salvation, because you touched on salvation for Jews as communal. It's the entire nation, not an individual. Salvation, according to Christianity, is very personal and follows the practices of Roman conversion to paganism, not any ever recorded history of conversion to Judaism before Christianity. The salvation process of Christianity follows Roman tradition, but the making of Paul is Jewish now, and a pesharim and a midrash, and oh my God, that's
No, I can speak on that. So let me just quickly say, because this will cut right to the chase. Yeah. So several years ago, my son-in-law Brian, who is a published scholar, he attended the Society of Biblical Literature conference, which happens every year, SBL. And he attended as the roommate of Mark Nanos. So Mark Nanos is the spearhead scholar which heads up the Paul Within Judaism movement. There's other scholars as well that have gotten on board since him, but he was the primary scholar that started it all. And his seminal work, which was an edited collection of essays by various people, including himself, was called Paul Within Judaism. This was a fringe form of Pauline scholarship that began to take off a bit. Other scholars of note, such as Paula Fredrickson, Magnus Zetterholm, and others, all of which, by the way, are atheists, started championing this as well as an exciting new branch of Pauline scholarship. And they're all looking for something new anyway, so this was like exciting for them to delve into. I happen to know for a fact. So Mark Nanos, who is the most prominent scholar in the Paul Within Judaism field, and the FFOZ crowd, they just like basically worship this guy. I know him personally. My son-in-law knows him much better than I do. As I said, he roomed with him. Mark Nanos is a liberal Jew who was a former businessman who took upon Pauline studies and his original work, The Irony of Galatians, which was his initial, and he wrote another one on Romans, which is very convoluted. But at any rate, his whole point was to try to mitigate Christian anti-Semitism. So Mark Nanos' idea was, if you could recontextualize Paul as a Hellenized Jew who was advocating to his brethren a reconception of Messianic expectations, and couch Paul in the milieu of a Jew arguing with other Jews, essentially. That if Christians could embrace this idea, rather than the traditional narrative that Paul was denouncing the law, denouncing Jewish exceptionalism, denouncing Jewish practice, the strict observance of kosher for Gentile, that Paul was advocating from within Judaism, not against Judaism, essentially. That his idea was that if that idea could propagate, and he could make an argument for it, that it would help to reverse many centuries of Christian persecution of the Jewish people. That was his entire motivation. A noble goal. He doesn't believe any of it.
I mean, it's like secular Hebrew rootism, though. It's a Hebrew rootism for the secular mind.
You have to understand. So, like, if you're an atheist, or if you're a secular Jew, and your goal is the health of your community, Mark Nanos doesn't care about the arguments within Christianity about doctrine. He doesn't care about any of that stuff. He's not a Christian. He has no intention of becoming one. There are actually Messianic Christians out there. My son-in-law went to a conference by Messianics. He was invited to it, where Mark Nanos was invited to speak. And they were just like gushing over him. Like, people in the audience were like, "You've changed my life by helping me embrace Judaism and Christianity together. You've made all the dots connect." And Mark walks off the stage and he talks to my son-in-law and he's just shaking his head like, "Oi, like, what the heck is going on here? Like, I'm not advocating Messianic Judaism. I'm not advocating Jesus. Like, that's not his position." Another one, Paula Fredrickson. She's, as far as I know, she's a professor at Vanderbilt. Maybe she's moved on. She used to be at Boston University. Brilliant scholar. She doesn't believe any of this stuff. Yeah. It's just a profession for her. Yeah. Magnus Zetterholm. Magnus Zetterholm was another famous scholar that he wrote, I think, 1 or 2 essays in the Paul Within Judaism book. The reason I'm saying all this is because these are the people that these Messianic Jewish people are championing and saying, we have it on authority that Paul was a observant Jewish man, and that Jesus was an observant Jewish man, and that they are promoting rabbinic Jewish principles here. And the people who are writing the scholarship that they are quoting don't believe it. Yeah. It's people don't understand the world of academia.
To give a stream analogy that I make a point, but it's like the black guy that shows up at the KKK meeting and starts saying all the things that they like, and they're like, "Look, it must be true."
Right, exactly. It's a crude analogy, but yeah, it works. And so the Paul with it. So let me deal with the core claims quickly. I won't take a lot of time on this, but now that I've debunked the source of the information, not that I've debunked it, I don't want to say it that way. I'm not debunking their scholarship. Their scholarship is great. But when I say their scholarship is great, it doesn't mean that I agree with it. It means that they've done a great job researching and trying to come up with an argument. There's some very eloquent arguments that are made for it. I'm not going to deny that. I've read the books. But ultimately, it doesn't hold water, because the reality is that, so first of all, Paul is from Tarsus. Try to find in Jewish sources any connection to the ancient Jewish world and the city of Tarsus, which was, by the way, a place where the only thing that was of significance in Tarsus was that that's where a Roman legion was stationed. There was no Jewish community there. So for these people to claim that Paul was, a potential, I've heard it claimed that Paul was the heir apparent to the Nasi of the Sanhedrin. And if people don't know what the Nasi was, a Nasi is a Jewish term for the head of the Sanhedrin. People in the Messianic world claim that Paul was an inheritor. He was an heir apparent he was a savant. He was not a Talmud, but a Torah savant of the oral tradition. He was in line to be the Nasi. If that were true, then we would have records of him in the Jewish tradition, like we do for all other great sages of the Jewish tradition. Paul is unknown in the Jewish tradition.
And to the early Christians, too.
Right. So the whole notion of Paul within Judaism. Okay, so what do you do with Galatians? So Mark Nanos wrote The Irony of Galatians. And then he wrote another book about Romans. So Mark Nanos has a and I'll just talk about him because he's the one I'm most familiar with. I've also read Fredrickson and the other ones, but I'm most familiar with Nanos. I've had personal correspondence with him. So in Romans, in fact, he personally sent me his original paper that he published that ended up becoming incorporated into his book. He sent it to me, and I have it. I have it down in my office. I don't have an office, but down in my bookcase. He sent it to me. I have it in a 3-ring binder. So the whole argument is based on wordplay in the Greek, talking about, because we're dealing, of course, with Romans 11 through 13, or is it 9 through 11? I forget. The part of Romans where it talks about, Israel has been cut off for a season and then will be grafted back in, and who are you to boast who has been grafted into the original branch? Don't you boast against it. Oh, you have to wrap up. Okay. So anyways, let me wrap up. Let me cut to the chase. You guys can research that on your own. But the very controversial passage in Romans that deals with Israel being partially hardened. So that is a passage that Mark Nanos took particular umbrage with, because he viewed Matthew 27, which is the whole, or is it Matthew 25, where it talks about let his blood curse be upon us and all of our children in Matthew. He viewed that verse, and he also viewed the passage in Romans where it talks about Israel being partially hardened, but in the end they will all be saved. That those are the core texts that the church has used throughout the centuries to persecute and justify the pogroms and the persecutions of Jews. That they're in rebellion, they need to repent, and until they repent, anything we do to them is justified because they're in rebellion against God. That's been the traditional position of the church. So that was his whole thing. So the whole Paul within Judaism movement is designed to try to mitigate that. Let me make one last point. There's another guy by the name of Rabbi Kinzer. Rabbi Kinzer is a Jewish Christian who is a very good man, very humble man. He has great relationships with the cardinals of the Vatican. Mark Kinzer was instrumental in the formation of the relatively recent document, which was an update of the Catholic position on the Jews. And it's very controversial. The evangelicals all hated it. The position that the Jews have a relationship with God outside of Jesus.
No stereotype.
Yes, and Mark Kinzer wrote a book called Post-Missionary Messianic Judaism, an argument to justify Messianic Judaism apart from evangelical proselytizing efforts. The problem with his theory is Judaism already has a solution to that problem. It's called the 7 Noahide laws.
Yeah.
You don't need to go through any kind of a crazy extrapolation to try to justify Jews not accepting Jesus. Judaism never requires anybody to believe and become Jewish. Judaism simply says, be a righteous person, and everyone can have a place with God. That's what Judaism teaches.
Yeah, and on that note, I do have to bring it to an end, and we can get a little more into this a little further. We covered a lot. This was a good talk. I got to do the call with my kids now, so I can't really continue this right now. But we covered some good points, and we're at a good spot. You want to say last words real quick?
I just want to express my appreciation for you, Jeremiah, because of the work you're trying to do. I think it's coming from a good heart and a good place, a place of inquiry, genuine desire to try to connect dots and help people understand. I don't think you have an axe to grind. I don't ever sense that you're trying to get at a certain group of people or try to get revenge on anybody. You truly have a good heart in this, and that's why I'm willing to participate in this with you. And I think I hope that your work continues to find success, and keep being a great dad to your kids. I love your posts.
All right, great. Well, I appreciate you, and it was good, insightful, and yeah, we'll go ahead and wrap on that. And we'll come back on some of this. We were getting into some good stuff, but this went long, and
you can break it up if you have to.
Yeah. So, anyways, I appreciate you, and for everybody following, make sure you like and subscribe. Tune in at Jesus the Jew within Judaism.com, the Facebook group, and YouTube, and stay in touch for further episodes.